Well, now this morning our study of the Gospel of Mark continues. As you know, this is a chapter-by-chapter exposition. Today we come to chapter 6. We will enter directly into the text, and we're going to take it in 4 parts, speaking of rejection, loss, need, and storm. Verse 1, Jesus has been using, as you know, Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee as his base of ministry. Here we see a map, and it shows near the top of the sea, Capernaum. But now he is going to, as we come into verse 1, travel to his hometown, returning there to Nazareth for a ministry visit. And his disciples, it says in verse 1, were with him. And in verse 2, on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue. So in so doing, Jesus shows us the priority of public worship and Bible teaching. Is everyone hearing this? Those who say, oh, I'll just sort of be alone with Jesus and not be together with the body of Christ for worship and for Bible teaching would be running counter to Jesus' own practice. When he was in a town, he would go where there could be such Bible teaching. And in fact, in the synagogue, Jewish men, especially visitors, were invited to share a word from Scripture. And so, in this case, Jesus taught. The listeners were surprised by his deep understanding of the Bible. He appeared to them to have a spiritual power, a power for teaching and for mighty works, and they wondered how this could be. They said, and you see this in verses 2 and 3, they said, where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? The hometown people expressed several reasons why they really couldn't receive him as an authoritative teacher. They said, first of all, is not this the carpenter? Now, that word carpenter in the ancient world meant, yes, a builder with wood, as we would understand it, but also a stonemason or a metal worker. In other words, what they were saying is that he's in the building trades. And they knew that that was true of his father, Joseph, and they assumed that that was still best suited for him because they said, well, he's not a trained rabbi. How did he show up here as a teacher with disciples? He's in the building trades. Second, they said, isn't this the son of Mary? And that's probably intended to be a slur. If Joseph was still living, he'd be the son of Joseph. If Joseph was dead, he would be the son of Joseph. That's what they would normally call him. But I think what they're thinking is that there's a sort of an insinuation that maybe there's something morally irregular about Jesus' birth. And so they say, well, isn't this the son of Mary? And they say, we know his brothers, and they name the 4 of them, and we know his sisters, verse 3. They thought they knew Jesus so well that they couldn't imagine following him. But they didn't know Jesus for who he really is. Let's listen now. We see this every time we have a baptism service in our church. There will be people who will give testimony to how they're now giving their lives to Jesus, and not a few of them will say, I thought I knew all about Jesus. I grew up in a Christian home, and I heard the Bible stories, and it all was very familiar, and I supposed I probably was a Christian, and now I've awakened to the fact that I didn't know Jesus at all, and I didn't know him as Savior. I wasn't saved. I need Christ. Isn't that a common theme? Sometimes the hardest ones to reach for Jesus are the ones who think they already have Jesus, and they don't. And these people thought they already knew Jesus. They already had him. Yeah, he was so familiar, they didn't take him seriously. And they took offense at him, it says in verse 3. They were offended by him in their hearts, and they rejected him. His own neighbors rejected him, those he grew up with. His own relatives rejected him. If you read in the Gospel of Luke, it tells us that on one visit back to Nazareth, the people were so offended by Jesus that they attempted to throw him off a cliff. That's a very thorough picture of rejection. His own hometown rejecting him. Jesus could see that they thought they knew him, so it was easy to dismiss him, which of course they were doing to their own harm. And he says, verse 4, a prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and among his relatives and his own household. So, verse 5, as a result of their rejection, he could do no mighty work there. Yes, it says he healed a few sick people. Now, one of my sons said to me recently, if someone came to a meeting like this and he healed a few sick people, we'd say, that's a miracle, that's wonderful. And it is, except that when Jesus went from town to town, the Bible describes it as droves of people coming to be healed. And in this case, it wasn't a mighty work compared to the other things he was doing because the people had such hardened hearts. It tells us he could do no mighty work there among them because of this. And it tells us as we get to verse 6, he marveled because of their unbelief. Now, the Bible tells us that there were two things that made Jesus marvel. If you read through the story of Jesus' life, there's two kinds of things where they use the word marvel and say, Jesus marveled about this. And one category of this is time and again, there's somebody who might come from a Gentile background, somebody who didn't really know the Jewish scriptures, somebody who had very faint idea of who God was, who would put great faith in Jesus and say, I trust you. And Jesus would marvel that such a one with so little understanding would believe. But the other category of people that Jesus marveled at were the ones who had the scriptures, knew what God said, and were rooted in unbelief. He marveled about that too. For most of us, we are in the category of those who have more than one Bible in our home, have heard more than one Bible message, and probably know more than one Bible-believing Christian. And if we are in the position of unbelief, the position of saying, yeah, okay, fine, but I'm living my own life instead, Jesus would marvel at that and say, really? You? How can this be? Our slide asks this, are you a marvel to Jesus? And in which way? Are you a marvel that you could be saved from such background and have faith? Or are you a marvel that you were exposed to such truth and have not faith? These are the things that Jesus marvels about. Well, since he was rejected in his hometown, and I'm going to just, again, for a moment, point out, what kind of sting would there be if you went to your own family, relatives, hometown, and they say, we reject you? That's just what's happened to Jesus. So he left, verse 6, went about among the villages teaching, and he sent out his disciples to do the same. The Bible says he sent them out 2 by 2. Here we have a picture of them going off in pairs, and he's sending them off obviously in 6 two-man pairs. I asked my Hope group, we were studying through this, I said, why did Jesus send them out 2 by 2? I asked them that. And one of them smiled and said, well, that's how the animals boarded the ark. But then someone recognized that ministry partnerships are essential for mutual spiritual support. This one said, you know, when I go out and do witnessing, I usually have 2 of us together, and one of us is sharing with whoever we're talking to, and the other is quietly praying, kind of supporting the whole thing in prayer. And then maybe the next person we talk to, we might do it the other way around, and I'll have a chance to share while he spends his time quietly praying, and we support each other. That's good, isn't it? Somebody else recognized that the Old Testament Scripture said that every matter has to be affirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. So if somebody came into a town and says, this is who Jesus is, and someone else stood next to him and says, I can affirm that, it's true, there'd be power in that. Both for going out and saying, this is who Christ is to the villages, and in some verses, they're all going to come back and report what happened, and there'll be 2 of them to affirm, that's true, that's what went on. And so for all of these kind of reasons, the Lord sent them out into small ministry teams, 2 by 2, and he gave them some ministry training. And we can look at verses 7 and following and see some of this training. First of all, we've already identified that they were to go out 2 by 2, and verse 7, they were given authority over the unclean spirits, meaning they were going out in the power of Jesus. If it's only in their own strength, it's not going to work. But he gave them his spiritual power to go out. And verse 8, he charged them to take nothing for their journey. Why? This is meant to train them in complete dependency on God rather than human resources. Do you understand this? The Lord, if he sends you to serve him, will frequently send you in such a way where he says, I'm not giving you extra. I'm not giving you anything you can count on, where you can say, oh, well, it's not going to be that difficult. I've got all of this stuff I can rely on. He'll say, I'm going to put you in a situation where you're going to have to completely depend on me. That's normal. And so God has arranged for Jesus to send out his disciples to learn this lesson. Nothing in this case, verses 8 and 9, means no extra food. They're going to have to depend on God every day for their food. No bag of belongings. No extra money. Not even an extra coat. You say, what's the deal with the extra coat? Well, it's like this. If you're traveling and you say, well, maybe no one will accept me here in this village. Maybe I'm not going to have a place to stay. Maybe there's going to be no home to stay in. I can always take my big extra cloak and wrap it around me like a sleeping bag and curl up under a tree and stay the night. He said, don't take your extra coat. You're going to have to depend by prayer that every night you're going to have a place to stay. And it's not like you're going to be able to make reservations somewhere. You're going to have to pray, God, give me an open door to stay somewhere tonight. God, give me a meal tonight. God, give me the funds I need for the next stage. He says, I'm going to train you that you're going to depend entirely on me about these things. And it says, by the time we get to verse 10, that if God provides a place to stay in a village, stay there until you depart for the next village. You say, what's that all about? I'm going to say something to you. Most of ministry is, number one, rooted in real relationships with people, and number two, a complete dependence on God. There are folks who lack focus in their life of serving the Lord, and they try to have an iron in a whole lot of different fires, and they will, or they'll have a lot of irons in the same fire. I don't know which analogy to use. God will bring them somewhere. It might be a home church, and you say, this is your platform for ministry. And every so often they'll bounce around other places, and they'll get involved in a lot of other things, and they'll spread themselves very thin, and they're not rooted anywhere particularly. In other words, it says, that's not the kind of ministry I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to did it, it says, to please Herodias, his new wife. Because John the Baptist had said publicly, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. See verse 18. John the Baptist preached God's truth, and he says, you may not be married to someone else's wife. That's what he said. Instead of repenting, Herodias, verse 19, had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death. Is it possible that the wife of a ruler could find somebodies to serve as either assassins or others to kill off someone she didn't like? Is that possible? Aha. That's what she wanted to do. But she could not, verse 19. Why not? Largely because even though King Herod imprisoned John, he also protected John against his wife murder's plots. In other words, keeping him in prison and keeping a close eye on him was not only keeping him from preaching against him, but was also keeping his wife from murdering him. This puts Herod in sort of an interesting spot, doesn't it? All right, so it says that Herod is protecting him, and this is interesting to me. The Bible says that Herod feared John, knowing he was a righteous and holy man. He kept him safe, and more than that, he had private meetings with him and had times where either he himself went in the dungeon or he had him brought out of the dungeon and would say, tell me more about this whole deal. He was like, wow. No, I'm not going to do that, and put him back in the dungeon. And so he was sort of fascinated by all of this, and he wanted to hear it, but then he didn't apply it. So that's what Herod was doing. But, verse 21, an opportunity came. And I don't mean an opportunity like a good opportunity. I mean an opportunity like a bad opportunity. Herodias, the vengeful wife, is looking for some way to kill John the Baptist. and she finds that way. It happens this way. It tells us in verse 21 that Herod threw himself a birthday party. And he invited all the nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. He wanted to impress these men. Then a girl came in to dance, and it was not a sweet dance, but a lascivious dance. And it wasn't a hired performer, but a member of the household. You see, Herodias had figured it all out. The vengeful wife had figured this out, and she sent her own teenage daughter, the daughter from the previous marriage. She sent the daughter from the previous marriage to do the dance, knowing that the king, being in a magnanimous mood at a party, would offer to give her a gift. That would be the thing that would happen. She knew this. And she thought, aha, if I send her in to dance in a fleshly way and she's offered a gift, I'm going to have her come back and I'm going to tell her, whatever the king says about a gift, come to me and I will tell you what the gift must be. Is everyone following the plot? This was thought through ahead of time. And sure enough, Herod says, verse 22, ask me for whatever you wish and I will give it to you. He made a vow proclaiming anything up to half the kingdom he would give to her. And that's what Mom hoped would happen. The girl had been told, I think, to report back to Mom, and the mom would tell her what to say. Now, the girl, I don't know who she was and exactly what age she was, but I sort of imagine that she might have asked for a horse or a boat or something she'd enjoy. Is that right? And I'm sure that Mom probably said, listen, dear, I can get you a horse or a boat. That's not a problem. I'll take care of that. Here's what you're going to ask for. And so the girl went back to the king. She rushed back to the king, and she said, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. That's what Mom told her to ask for. Not later, when you can rethink this. I want it at once, right now. I think there's at least 3 lessons we can learn from this episode. First of all, people make bad spiritual decisions when they want to impress their worldly friends. In Herod's case, it says he was exceedingly sorry, and he knew that what was going to happen was completely wrong, but because of his guests who heard his promises, he didn't want to look weak. Is this true? If you're trying to impress your worldly friends and you don't want to look weak, you could make some terrible decisions. That's what happened to Herod. He cared more about what they thought than about what God thought. So, verse 27, he sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. Let's bring the head right here to the party. Let's give it to the girl. I'm going to say to all of you, listen now. Do not make worldly people to be your friends at any age of your life. You will make foolish, sinful, sometimes deadly choices. I did not say do not love and care for worldly people. We are called to minister to all. But when you have them as the ones you want to impress, and I know that some people say the pastor's talking to teens. Herod was not a teenager. I'm talking to people of every age. When you make your decisions based on what will impress ungodly people, you can be making very bad spiritual decisions. A second lesson, do not falsely use your kids to fulfill your own vain ambitions. You understand that this girl was removed from her own natural father because Mom wanted a new life with a different husband, her brother-in-law. And the girl was then taught to gain approval through fleshly presentation of her body. And the girl's now being handed an object on a platter that would scar anyone's memories for life. I wouldn't want to be presented with such a thing on a platter. What teenage girl would? The mother is doing this to get her revenge, using her daughter to bring it about. I can tell you that many parents use their own children, sometimes for weapons in family fights, sometimes as objects of personal pride. They'll point to what they're doing in aspects of upper-level sports or entertainments and things, and this is really the parents' doing. Sometimes it's a means to get the approval of family and friends. And this generally ends badly. The kids can tell eventually that they're being used, and God can tell that He's not being glorified. Our children are meant to be given over to the service of Christ and not given over to our own ambitions. And thirdly, I think it is right to recognize loss, to get alone with God, to spiritually process grief. Godly people, it says, will get alone with God to process such grief. When the disciples of John the Baptist heard about this execution, they, the disciples, it says in verse 29, came and took the body, laid it in a tomb. The Gospel of Matthew says in chapter 14 that then the next thing they did after they buried him is they went and told Jesus. They knew they must tell him. Jesus was John's cousin. John had been joined to Jesus in ministry. And Jesus, I guess they would know, was clearly at risk of spiritual and political attack the same way John had been. And Matthew writes that Jesus, on hearing the news, immediately tried to get alone to pray. And Mark suggests the same. Jesus and his disciples will try to go away to a desolate place to be able to be alone and for Jesus to pray. But they're going to be followed by a needy crowd, and only later, when we get to verse 46, is Jesus really able to get alone on a mountain to pray. And I'm going to tell you something. Is everyone listening? Sometimes there's a great loss in someone's life. Sometimes there's something that is really a grievous thing that happens, and life keeps moving so fast, the individual says, I never really took the time to bring it to Jesus and to properly process and grieve. I know people who haven't processed and grieved things that happened years ago. They said, I shut the door on that, and it's still in the closet, and I haven't dealt with it. Godly people will properly say, this was a loss. This was necessary for me to grieve. I'm going to bring it to Jesus Christ. I'm going to do this personally in order to be settling this matter. These are all things we might learn from this terrible episode, and it brings us now to the third part of our message. We've already seen so far in this chapter Jesus facing rejection and then loss. And yet I can tell you he doesn't lose his compassion for others, his heart of ministry for those in need. Can I tell you how amazing that is? If you have people reject you and you have various losses, one of the things that tends to happen is you build up this wall that says, I'm done. I'm done dealing with people. I no longer have compassion for others. That didn't happen to our Lord Jesus. And it shouldn't happen to those who follow him. We come now to the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 30, first it tells us the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught, and now the flashback is done. We're back up to current time here. We're in real time. And it says, thus far, of course, Jesus has been under much pressure. The disciples have had a heavy season of ministry. Many people are crowding around them. Notice verse 31, so much that they had no leisure even to eat. Is this a high-pressure situation when so many crowds are forming around you, you can't stop to have lunch? And Jesus has been informed just now of John the Baptist's death. So Jesus says, verse 31, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. They got into a boat and went, verse 32, to a desolate place by themselves. They said, we're going to get alone and we're going to deal with things privately alone. However, the crowd saw him leave by boat. Many of them dropped everything. Let's picture the scene. Are you picturing this with me? Jesus' disciples get in the boat, and they start heading across the northern part of the lake. And the crowd says, there he goes! And a whole bunch of them, without any thought to what they were going to do about dinner, started running around the lake. And they could see the boat out there, And they said, I see where it's going. They kept running. I see where it's going. We see where it's going to come in. And they were all there when the boat arrived. And some of you say, really? They could outrun a boat? Oh, trust me. I've been to places, I've had my family stay places where there was a pond and there was a rowboat. I could run around the pond twice before the rowboat got across it. You know how these things go, burp, 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 and they go along. And so the disciples all go in the boat, and the people run around the lake, and they get there before it arrives. I've got a picture of this. They're arriving. There's the crowd to meet them. And it says in verse 34, Jesus had compassion on them, which reflects the love of God. Clearly the people are needy. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve, so he ministered to their need. He recognized, verse 34, that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things because their primary need was spiritual. Hear it. Their primary need was spiritual. He needed to teach them. They were like sheep without a shepherd, and so he gave them spiritual food. And for the rest of the day, even though he planned to have a time alone, he gave them spiritual food that they needed. They needed it. But they're also going to need physical food. They took off running around the lake without making provision for supper. And so when it grew late, notice this, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, verse 35, verse 36, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. The disciples come and they say to Jesus, send them away. This is their ministry strategy. Send the people away. Jesus said, verse 37, you give them something to eat. He asks them to do something that seems impossible. I'm going to break this down for you if I can. Jesus had sent them out 2 by 2. And so, Jim, if I could have you and Jacob just stand up, you'll be my 2 right now, okay? You're my 2. And you went out 2 by 2, and you learned that you could trust God for enough to eat and a place to stay for the 2 of you. You learned that in the previous travels, right? You got it for the 2 of you. You got that? Got it. Now Jesus says, I'll tell you what, you guys, it's not just depending on me for the 2 of you. There's all 5,000 of them. You give them something to eat. Is that a stretch of faith?
Yes.
You didn't learn the 5,000 trick. You only learned the 2 trick. And so Jesus is stretching them, and he's saying, I want you to know that there's even more spiritual power. You 2 are going to feed the whole bunch of them. And they're going to say, thank you, that was very good. You did a wonderful job with that. Now, they're going to say to him, shall we go, verse 37, and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And somebody says, how much is 200 denarii? 1 denarius was the amount that you would get for working a whole day. This is 200 days' wages. This is 2/3 of a year's income. If your income for your job for the year is $60,000, this would be a $40,000 deal. So you would just say to me, are you serious? Do you want me to pay $40,000 for this crowd to get something for supper? Do you have $40,000? You don't, not right then. You don't even have the $40,000. But if you did, if you happen to be able to go out and borrow the $40,000 and then go shopping for them all and then try to prepare something for them all and have dinner right now,
Doesn't seem feasible.
it doesn't seem feasible. That's what they're trying to express. It doesn't seem like we can do that. Jesus told them to find out how much they already had. Notice verse 38. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. We're told elsewhere that Andrew, one of the 12, located a boy with some packed food, which turned out to be 5 loaves. And by loaves, when I was growing up, I thought, a loaf of bread in a big shrink-wrap package. It's this big. Loaves of bread were more like dinner rolls, okay, kind of flat dinner rolls. It was something you'd eat 2 or 3 or 4 of in a single meal. This was an individual-sized deal. This kid had 5 loaves for his own supper. And he had 2 fish. And of course, where I grew up, a fish was, a king salmon that weighed 60 pounds. But they meant fishes. And they meant the little snack-sized fish. And by that, they meant dried snack-sized fish. You've been to the Oriental store and you see the little dried snack-sized fish and still got the eyeball in it and all that. There were 2 of those. 2 of those and the 5 personal loaves. That's how much they had. I've got a picture of them bringing it to Jesus, saying, we found the boy, and he's on the right, and we got the 5 little loaves, and I asked Timothy where the fish were. He said they're underneath the loaves. The fish are right underneath there. That's what it is. And they reported Jesus, this is what we've got. It's a spiritual fact. And let's make sure we understand this. Jesus said, tell me everything you have. Give to me everything you have, and then I can do what comes next. What if everything you have is 5 loaves and 2 fish? Give it all to Jesus. I'll tell you something else. People who are really desperate and say, I only have this much, oftentimes say, I'll give it to Jesus. People who are not so desperate and say, I have this much, say, I'll give this much to Jesus. How much is Jesus asking us to give him? All of it. The whole kit and caboodle. All of it. It's a spiritual fact that if we withhold what we have for ourselves and are unwilling to offer it all to Jesus, then we will rarely see any move of God in our lives. If you have this much and the Lord says, I want you to do this ministry, do you know how much of this much is given him for that ministry? All of it. The greatest ones involved in Christian ministry over the centuries, some of them inherited vast fortunes, and they gave it all to the Lord, and then they began to see Jesus really work. We will rarely see any move of God in our lives until we give it all. But if we know how Jesus would have us to serve, and we give to him every single thing we have, even if it's woefully inadequate, and this little bit of food is very inadequate, we may see a great move of God in our lives. If you would seek to serve God, locate what little you have and give it all to him. Well, Jesus organized the people into groups. Notice verse 39 and 40. He set them out in groups of 100 and groups of 50, and he had them sit on the green springtime grass. And you say, what's this all about? Well, one thing, this is really clear. If there's going to be a crowd of 5,000, and if somebody says, we've now got stacks of pizza here at the front, what is going to happen? Can you picture the chaos of everybody coming and trampling each other? Can you picture the disorder? Can you picture the way in which it's going to create all kinds of havoc and somebody could get hurt? Can you picture it? Jesus knows these things. You see, what he does is in his church, he brings order. In a family, he brings order, and he even describes what that order is to be. In a church, he brings order. And the New Testament documents describe how the order is supposed to be so that there isn't somebody who has to get hurt. Jesus brings order. And in this case, he says, what I'd like you to do, he tells the disciples, have everybody sit down and have them sit in groups of 50 and 100 and have them all seated, and then we're going to deliver bits of food to each of those groups that are scattered around so that there isn't some kind of a stampede or a commotion this way. And so Jesus provides such order, and it reminds me just of this. They're all sitting down on the green grass, it says. Do you remember the 23rd Psalms? He makes me lie down in green pastures. He brings me to everything I need, the food, the water, what I need. Jesus is doing that. Following Jesus is not disorderly. I wrote down, to this day, he provides much structure for his people, the church. Well, Jesus took the little that they had, the 5 loaves, the 2 fish, verse 41, he looked upward to heaven and blessed God for this provision. Do you know it's God who made that food to begin with? The 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Who gave that to them? It was God. God made those fish. God created the grain that made that bread. He thanked the Lord for this. Then he gave this little amount over to his disciples, and they in turn set it before the people. First the loaves, and then verse 41, he divided the fish among them all. He took the 2 little fishes and divided it among them all. And they all ate, verse 42, and were satisfied. Something has just multiplied. Something has happened. Something has happened where that little bit became so much that it wasn't just that they all got a bite and that was real nice. They all got stuffed. And when they got stuffed, we know that they were satisfied because when it was done, there was more than enough for the people, so much that there was an abundance, and afterward they picked up 12 baskets of leftovers at the end of the dinner, verse 43. I want you to notice this. First, there's not a lacking God's supply. Is that true? There's not a lacking in God's supply. And secondly, and we're going to think theoretically for a moment, let's suppose at the end of the dinner somebody said, well, I'm just not feeling fed. I didn't get anything. Was there enough provided? Was there a spiritual and physical provision for these people that was sufficient? Anyone who didn't get any was because he refused or rejected it. I'm not sure if anyone did. There's no record of anyone doing that, but it teaches us a lesson. It was available, it overflowed, it was extra. And sometimes people do refuse things, and we see this whenever there is a spiritual meal being served. I'm going to just look at all of you for a moment. I'm going to say something from the pastor's perspective. Sometimes there's a wonderful time of worship, and there is teaching from God's Word, and there's prayer, and people are being fed, and I can see it. I can look on the faces of people, and they're just soaking it in. They're feeding it. And then I look over at someone, and that one is dinking on his phone, and he's completely tuned out. Or that one is whispering to her friend, and the two of them are whispering back and forth through the whole thing, and they're completely tuned out. Or somebody has a sort of a scowl and a sort of a negative heart, like, I'm thinking accusing thoughts about others, and I don't know if I'm going to trust anything that's here, and I am really having a sort of a dark moment with myself, and that one's completely tuned out. Did you know that that's apparent? All you have to do is stand at the front of the room, and you can see all that going on. Later what happens is the one with the dark thoughts and the one who is poking her friend and the one who is dinking on his phone will go home, and I know what will happen. He will say to his parents, she will say to her parents, she will say to her husband, he will say to his wife, they're not feeding us there. We're not getting anything out of this. There's nothing there for us. We're not getting anything out of this. We may as well go somewhere else. We may as well do something different. That wasn't worth anything to me. Was the spiritual food being distributed? Was it being distributed in more than abundance? Were there some who might say, I refused it and didn't eat of it, and now I don't feel spiritually full? Could that happen? It does. It's a frequent occasion whenever you get a group of people together. Sometimes those same folks will say it a little differently. Instead of saying, I didn't get any spiritual food, they'll say, I don't know if I feel accepted by the others. They all seem so different from me. Well, in a way, that's true. They were all drinking in the spiritual content, and you weren't. So those ones will stray further toward the sidelines. They might absent themselves from future gatherings because they're not being fed. But God takes the morsels of our praises and prayers. I want to tell you something. What we have to offer. If somebody says, what do we have to offer here at any Christian meeting? We have the equivalent of 5 little loaves and 2 fish. We don't have a lot to feed everybody. In ourselves, we have very little. But God takes those little morsels. He takes the morsels of our admonishing one another with the Word of God, and He can multiply it many times over for those who have a heart to receive it and feed on it. I guess I learned that one time. I went one time when I was a kid, and I went to what I thought was the most boring sermon I'd ever been to. I watched the clock. I didn't have a heart to receive. I was one of those. Afterward, there was a dear missionary couple. They were visiting our church that day. And with tears coming down her face, the missionary wife said, that was exactly what God needed to speak to me about. And she was just thrilled that God had ministered to her. The speaker was no great shakes. I was bored to death. But God's word was read, and people prayed, and God ministered to her because she was ready to receive. That taught me something that day. If you come into a setting and there's a morsel of God's truth and there's a morsel of God's word and the people have prayer for one another, God can fill you and multiply this abundantly. Now, how many were fed that day? Verse 44, how many? 5,000 men. I wondered about that for a long time. First of all, I thought, who went through and went 1, 2, 3, 4, and counted them? And then it dawned on me, it wasn't hard to count. They were already seated in 50s and 100s. 50, 100, 200, 300, 400. It was not difficult. You just counted by 50s and 100s. You get this? Secondly, you say, yeah, okay, they were seated in that. You could count them that way. But who goes about counting just the men? One guy, two guys, skip her, one guy, skip her. Who would do that? I thought, this is weird. And then I had the opportunity to have a hope group that met at a public park, and for one summer after another, we'd meet there, and the park was largely populated by Middle Eastern families who would come each evening, and they'd have sort of a cookout, and they would all gather on the ground to eat what had just been cooked. And you know how they gathered? All the men together, and the ladies and kids over there. And it suddenly dawned on me, of course. All the guys got on their track shoes and ran around the lake. And there were some ladies and kids who came along with them. And the ladies and kids were in their own little section. And all the guys were in these 50s and 100s because they ate that way as a natural course of their society. Did you understand all of this? It made sense finally. The disciples, without much effort, said, there were 5,000 men here. And then there was also the group of the ladies and kids over there too. So it was more than 5,000. This is a great miracle. Besides the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the greatest miracle, all of the other miracles that appear in the Gospels, there's lots of healings, and there's lots of other miracles. But of the miracles that you'll see, if you see a chart of all the miracles, only one of them appears in all four Gospels. Only one of them was deemed to be so central that it had to appear in all four of them, and that was this one, the feeding of the 5,000. That's interesting. And when you go to ancient Christian settings, the catacombs, somebody says, I don't know what a catacomb is. It has nothing to do with a cat or a comb. I'll show you. Here in the left, it's sort of underground caves and tunnels and things that Christians went to hide when they were under persecution. And inside the catacombs, they would put paintings or frescoes or sometimes tiled floors or other things as they lived there under persecution. And one of the most common symbols that they had was the symbols of the fish and the loaves. You say, okay, this obviously meant a lot to them. It appeared in all four Gospels. It was very, very powerful to them. What is this about? Well, it really was this. They reveled in God's abundant, miraculous provision. And I don't mean in a prosperity sense like, if we follow Jesus, we're going to get mansions. They were living in caves underground. They understood that they were on the run and there was trouble in this world. But God answers prayer and He spiritually feeds us, and we're filled and satisfied. We're filled and satisfied. God is good. They were learning this lesson that we're supposed to learn. Call on God, and He can do great things beyond what we can ask or imagine for His kingdom. And I can tell you, and I guess I can probably technologically prove this, but I don't think at the catacombs, while they were calling on God and trusting Him and putting these frescoes out with the fish and the loaves, that they were having ones fiddling on their phones and tuned out and saying they weren't being spiritually fed. They loved the bread and the fish that God gave them. This is something we're supposed to learn, to love what God is doing and to feed on what He's giving us. Well, we have just minutes left, and we're going to go on to the storm, verses 45 and following. Verse 45 begins with Mark's characteristic word, immediately. Jesus sent His disciples by boat back to the other side of the lake, and Jesus dismissed the crowd, then went up on the mountain to pray, verse 46. This is the much-needed time alone with God, the time alone with God that Jesus has been seeking. After the rejection, after the loss, after meeting the needs of others, He found His rest in God the Father. And now it's night. It's dark. Verse 47, the boat was out on the sea. He was alone on the land. And it says that Jesus could see that the boat was in the middle of the lake. Verse 48, He saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, I think I see another miracle here. Rocky, you're on the shore. It's 4 a.m., and it is pitch black. How do you see the boat and what it's doing in the middle of the lake? Jesus could see. Jesus knows exactly where we are and what our deal is even in the dark. And so he could see them out in the lake, and they were rowing hard, but the wind was coming against them, and they were making very, very, very little headway. Sometime between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., fourth watch of the night, the darkest part of the night, before the dawn, verse 48, he came to them walking on the sea. And he intentionally walked near them through the sharp wind, over the strong waves. They saw the form of a man walking on the sea, and they were terrified. They thought it was a ghost, verse 49. They cried out in fear, and I think I understand their fear. I would feel alarmed if I were out on a boat and a form of a person was walking on the water. So I don't have a problem with their fear. But I do have a problem with one thing. They didn't cry out in prayer. If there's a fearful situation, if there's a problem in your life, we need to be trained to cry out in. That was wimpy. We need to be trained to cry out in. That's it. When they faced, and I'm kind of doing a little bit of a backtracking here, when they faced the need of feeding 5,000, Jim, when you were told you needed to feed the 5,000, they gave a human reaction. They said, send the people away. But Jesus went to prayer, and he blessed the food and broke it. Now, when they're facing a scary situation at sea, they had a human response. They believed the worst. They cried out in fear. But Jesus has been spending the evening in prayer and was in step with God's leading. At each stage, we're supposed to be learning something. Jesus is testing them and saying, it's a big need, too big for you. You need to pray and trust the Lord and seek him in it. It's a scary situation. You need to be seeking him and finding his way in this. We're supposed to be learning from all of this. They were supposed to be learning from all of this. So Jesus spoke to them, verse 50, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. And then verse 51, he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and the storm was stilled, and they were utterly astounded. And it says, verse 52, they didn't understand. They didn't understand what in the world is going on here. First of all, why did we go all the way across the lake, all that effort going across the lake one direction, only to have this mob of people and be having something where we feed them, and then immediately we have to go back across the lake the other way, and there's this storm, and then Jesus scares us, and I don't understand. What's the point? They're not getting what the message is. They're not getting it. I will tell you this. They didn't get the lesson. It says in verse 52, their hearts were hardened, which means they were upset, and they thought the whole thing was dumb, and the lesson didn't sink in. Their hearts were hardened. And I would say, is this sinking in for us? Is it sinking in for us that we need to be crying out to the Lord for his provision and for his care rather than having the first human reaction that comes to us? Many of us will respond with fear or anger. Many of us will respond with self-protection and hurt. We'll respond with all kinds of human reactions, human emotional reactions to what's going on, rather than responding God's way. And Jesus is trying to teach them this, but is it sinking in for us? I will tell you that Jesus will keep testing us this way. The needs and the testing will be unending. Just when you think you've learned to trust God, there's a new test and a new lesson. Jim, just when you've trusted him for 2, then it's for 4, then it's for 5,000. The needs will get bigger, the testing will be bigger. In this case, the testing will keep going on and on. I'll tell you what the next testing is for Jesus and his men. They've just lost the whole night. They didn't sleep. They were rowing the whole night and they didn't sleep. They're going to need to get there and take a good nap. Is that right? The Bible says, as soon as they landed in the morning, verse 54, the people immediately recognized him, and they surrounded him. And Jesus and his men got no rest, no quiet solitude. The people ran to get the sick. They carried them on their beds, verse 55, for Jesus to heal them. Then it was more pressing needs in the villages, in the cities, in the countryside, it says. They laid out their sick on rows of beds in the marketplaces. They begged Jesus to touch them or that they could touch Jesus so that they would be healed, verse 56. And Jesus ministered to all of their need. That was a lot of need and not many sleeping nights. Next week, we're going to come to chapter 7. We'll prepare for that by reading it as you're in your homes this week, chapter 7. But we're going to end with today's On Your Mark. This is the summary of what we've learned, a chance for us to apply what we've heard. And this will bring us toward our conclusion. Let's see what it says. God allows seasons of testing. Let's try that again. God allows seasons of testing in our lives to train us to rely entirely on Him. We don't have the strength. We don't have the resources, but God wants us to learn to cry out to Him. Do you remember what we said earlier? Not our own human reaction. Instead, we're going to cry out in prayer. You will face rejection. You will experience loss. You will be called on to care for unending need. Do not harden your heart. Do not fail the test. Call on the Lord and wait for Him to answer your prayers. I'm going to ask our worship leaders to come forward and help us with the final song. And that last line said, we're going to call on Him and we're going to wait for Him to answer our prayers. Sometimes the answer is immediate. Sometimes in my life it has taken years. But we call on Him to answer such prayer, and we're not going to rely on our human reaction. We're not going to limit what God can do. Instead, we're going to say, God, I want your guidance in this matter. This is good. Will you all stand with me as we prepare for a final song?